thank the organizer of this conference, and Theon and Emma, you're doing a great job. And it's a very enriching conference that also gave me the opportunity to come back to Skopje. I was here 8 years ago, and let me tell you, it has changed quite significantly. I'm going to talk about imposing compromise-consociational arrangements in Macedonia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, since this is a comparative analysis, let me just make one caveat before I start. I could talk about each of those words in the title, consociational arrangements, consociation in Macedonia, consociation in Bosnia, for about an hour, and I would not be able to say everything. So I'm going to just focus on the main things that are of interest, I hope, for this particular event. Now, why do I choose Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina? Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina owe their constitutional structure to internationally mediated peace settlements. For Bosnia, this was the Dayton Peace Agreement of 1995, which gave an end to the war between Bosniaks, or Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. For Macedonia, it was the Ohrid Framework Agreement that ended the conflict of 2001 between ethnic Macedonians and Macedonian Albanians, who, for the reasons of linguistic simplicity, I shall call Macedonians and Albanians in the following. Both agreements follow the same current in political theory, an approach known as consociational democracy or the accommodation approach, and closely connected to names like Arndt Leibhardt, John McGarry, Brennan O'Leary, Jörg Steiner, etc. The central claim of this consociational theory approach is that once you have consociational democracy, consociational state structures, I will show you what this means, you will have stable democratic rule in a divided or plural society. In other words, political systems in Bosnia and Macedonia are comparable in this regard, in content, and should therefore also be equal in result. However, this is not the case. So we may ask ourselves, why not? And the hypothesis that I would like to put in front of you today is that we have to look at the conflict context and also at the effects of international intervention. However, being a political scientist and working in the field of political theory, I have a much larger goal than simply explaining those two cases. And this is the fundamental question that has been debated for the last 50 years, I think. Is consociationalism generally useful as an internationally imposed post-conflict political systems in divided societies? I shall talk about the historical and practical context in the following, the international and national goals of the two agreements, the provisions, the role of the actors, upon which I shall conclude. Let me just briefly walk you through the historical context as I see it and as it is most important for the approach of consociationalism. Let's start with Bosnia. The 1992 to 1995 war was ended with the Dayton Peace Agreement. The war itself claimed approximately 100,000 dead people, 2/3 of which were Bosniak, 1/4 to 1/5 were Serb, and 1/10 were of Croat origin. And half of the population was forced to move internally, usually to areas where their people inhabited the majority. The entire war was characterized by a brutal policy of territorial ethnic homogenization, or ethnic cleansing as it is better known, and this has two reasons. First of all, the ideology of the conflict itself made territorial ethnic homogenization a priority for the war leaders. This meant that the areas that are mixed the most will suffer the most, and Bosnia was such area, so this is not surprising. But there was also an international component in that since the first peace proposals for the structure of a new Bosnian state, the idea of cantonization was discussed, and the cantonization on ethnic grounds makes it a war aim in order to make the territory you wish to claim ethnically clean. So therefore, international peace treaties proposal actually increased the brutality of the war. The entire conflict happened within the historical pattern of group antagonism. I don't have time to go into all of this. It goes back to the Ottoman millet system, that all of you are familiar with. But the conflict was also complicated by the existence of kin states for the Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Serbs in their in Serbia and Croatia. And the presidents of Serbia and Croatia at that time saw themselves not only as presidents of Serbia and Croatia, but as presidents of the Serb or Croat nations. This meant they were presidents of the respective people wherever they might live. And this decreased, or actually led to the fact that there was no desire of the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Serbs to become a constituent nation within a multinational Bosnia. Therefore, the entire character of the state and its right to exist was at stake in this conflict. Now, having outlined these central configurations briefly, we can see major differences to the conflict in Macedonia in 2001. The fighting took only 8 months. It resulted in 200 dead people, 650 wounded, and 140,000 internally displaced. These numbers might be questionable, but I think we can all agree that this was not a full-fledged war. Stefan Trips calls it a drôle de guerre. The English translation is phony war, but I think it does not capture the essence of this sentence very much. And the reason for that is that the issue between Macedonians and Albanians is not as rooted in history as it is the case with the Bosnian issue. It had an external dimension in the events in neighboring Kosovo in the late 1980s, but also in the shift of national composition within Macedonia. In 1953, you had 12.5% Albanians. In 1994, there were 23%, even though these numbers are contested. And the reason for that is higher birth rates, but also refugees coming in from Kosovo. So this led to a split within the Albanian demos between the older, traditionally Macedonian Albanian elites and the newer Albanian elites. The problem was that post-1991 Macedonia was a state of the Macedonians per its constitution. Some authors speak of a constitutional nationalism that was displaced here. However, it is important to say that this constitution had strong minority protection guarantees, and that these guarantees were actually followed in reality. The major difference to the Bosnian case is that the Albanians did not see themselves as a national minority within Albania. They saw themselves as a constituent nation of Macedonia. So they wanted to be recognized as such. And then, of course, there were areas of friction that we were all well known: the Albanian University, the shortcomings in the minority educational system, the underground activities of Albanian separatists, but also a deficit within the integration of Albanian structures. Let me now come to the international and national goals of the agreements. In Bosnia, as we have seen, there were 3 different mindsets within the 3 groups regarding the future of the state, and its existence was generally put into question. Internationally, the goal, therefore, was a ceasefire, the preservation of the state and the end of the war, with a new political structure, whatever this structure might be. And this is the reason why Bosnia's post-war structure is a simple annex to the Dayton Peace Agreement. Even the most fearful critics of the Dayton Peace Agreement agree that Dayton succeeded in its primary goal in ending the war. However, it failed to establish a functioning state structures, and this is the reason why some authors suggest we should not talk about post-war Bosnia, but of we should talk about post-war Bosnia and not of post-conflict Bosnia, because the conflict is still there. In Macedonia, you had another situation. There was a divided leadership of the Albanians, as I explained. You had on the one side the NLA with its military arm, but you had also the moderate representatives of the Albanian parties. And one of the main aspects of the handling of the crisis was this, what I've termed delegitimize the messenger, accept the message. So by negotiating with the respected moderate Albanian parties who formed a coalition government at one time, even prior, you kind of try to delegitimize the NLA as a spokesperson of the Albanians. It was no everything or nothing negotiations. The state itself was never seriously threatened, as was the case in Bosnia. And this is the reason why the Ohrid Framework Agreement selectively altered the existing structure in several particularly important areas. It was not an entirely new state that was created. Internationals had a quite different approach. They wanted to find a diplomatic solution and not repeat the mistakes of Dayton, obviously, that by that time have become obvious. Now let me briefly talk about the provisions of the agreements. I said that both state structures follow the approach of consociational democracy. What does that mean? Basically, consociational democracy has 4 or 5 features, depending on how you count it. First, the grand coalition. All the groups are included in the government and parliament, proportional representation as an electoral system and as the composing principle of state administration. Group autonomy, which usually calls for some kind of federalization or gives certain groups the autonomy to regulate certain internal affairs among themselves, like personal marriage laws or something like that. And then consociationalism foresees certain veto possibilities, which are quite interesting, because in a situation where you have 3 groups, 2 groups always form a majority, we can presume. So in order to avoid legislation to be passed against the will and against the national interest of a group, this group can veto the process. Now, I shall explain to you how this was done in practice. In Bosnia, we have what Brandon O'Leary and John McGarry call a corporate consociational design. This means we have an absolute equality in political terms of the 3 constitutive nations, so not just proportionality, we have equality, and reserved seats and constitutionally prescribed executive power sharing. Everything is written down and everything has to be followed. We have far-reaching veto possibilities through the national interest clause. Every national group in parliament can veto a legislation or an act of government if it feels its national interest is being threatened, upon which the Constitutional Court can decide whether this is the case or not. Then we have an upper house of parliament constituted of 5 Bosniaks, 5 Croats and 5 Serbs, which is also a significant veto position because you need approval of both chambers of parliament. And this is made different by something that is called entity voting. This means for laws to pass, you have to have not only a majority in parliament, but also a majority in the lower chamber between the 2 parts of the country, the Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And in the upper chamber, you have to have a majority within all 3 groups, as well as an overall majority. In Macedonia, we see what in O'Learyan and McGarry terms is a liberal consociation. We have no reserved seats, but we have an open system of proportional representation with electoral districts that's designed to ensure minority representation. So you have minority representation, but it is not constitutionally prescribed. Then there is the 20% clause in the local self-government rule that I think your presentation also talked about that. When a community makes up 20% of a city, its language and alphabet become official. We have in Macedonia something very interesting, which is a voluntary executive power sharing between the Albanians and the Macedonians. And this has actually a historical pattern since 1991. Since 1991, the Albanians have been included into the government. And then we have the Badinter principle. That is also some kind of a double majority. A majority within the parliament and within the representatives of the non-majority group. But contrary to the Bosnian example, where this veto possibility can be used for all political decisions, in Macedonia it is strictly restricted to laws affecting culture, use of language, personal documentation, and the use of symbols. Now let me come to the role of the international actors. We can say that international actors were crucial in both cases, but they were more crucial in Bosnia than they were in Macedonia, because you had a general reluctance in Macedonia to excessively use force by both parties, and you had also mitigating circumstances in that you had a state. So the state was there, you could alter the state structure through the state's own procedures. Now, since my time is running up, I would like to just highlight the major problems in Bosnia. In Bosnia, the new state structure had to be implemented. And this was the role of the High Representative of the international community. He had to go there and make those people actually work together. However, he had no political strategy on how to do it. And after the first elections, reluctant nationalist politicians came into government, and they were now democratically legitimized. So what did the international community do? It gave the High Representative the so-called bond powers. which means that he can impose laws as he sees fit, and he can also remove uncooperative politicians even if they are democratically elected. Now, if we have a situation where the politicians can't get along, but there is an international overseer who can impose laws, he will do so. This has two consequences. First of all, you as a politicians will not do so. So you will become dependent on the internationals in order to do anything. And second of all, by doing so, you create a negative incentive structure in this kind of consociation. This means that non-cooperation is actually rewarded, and this leads to more extremist interventions. And just to show you what I mean, this is a slide of how many times the High Representative has imposed laws or used his bond powers per month on average. So you can see down there all the High Representatives and the average number of decreed decisions per month. And you can see that even today, it is not at zero. In Macedonia, the internationals were also crucial in the establishment, but their role politically was to assist the implementation of the agreement and to modernize the country. And when they did so, they felt some resistance in the first years. And Ulf Brunbauer says that it needed external monitoring, support, and occasional intervention in order for the Ohrid agreement to be implemented. And the reluctance came from certain parts of the ethnic Macedonians, and they, interestingly enough, for a political theorist, they were not so much against the veto possibilities or the Bodinder clause or so, but they were their discontent was with the change of the character of the Macedonian state. So they opposed the provision dealing with national identity and symbols. Now, the crucial difference to the Bosnian case is that the international community in Macedonia's case did not have their bond powers. Its approach was limited to the usual and internationally accepted suggestions, mediation, but not imposition. So you had a state, and the solutions had to be found within the state structures. And this was quite successfully done. So let me conclude. We have a different genealogy and circumstances of the two conflicts in Macedonia and in Bosnia, and it is this different history that makes, that makes the establishment of different consociation arrangements possible. We have a liberal system in Macedonia, and we have a corporate system in Bosnia. And we can explain this by looking at how the conflicts evolved and what was at stake. As I said, in Bosnia, the governing was handed over to the internationals, whereas in Macedonia, the locals remained the key decision makers. And we have different results, as I said. They're rather positive in Macedonia and rather negative in Bosnia. And I mean positive in the simple fact that the state can produce outcome. I don't mean that these policies that are implemented are good or bad. They're just positive in these terms. Now, what does this whole thing mean for consociational theory? First of all, it says that when we analyze consociational systems, we have to include contextual factors into the analysis. Also, in a highly globalized world, we also have to include the actions of external actors, because they can give a powerful insight into what was going on. Consociationalism seems an adequate theory for post-conflict constitutional design, mostly due to its flexibility. You can differently arrange those systems. So this means that the general approach of consociationalism is good, but it is also dependent on the genealogy. Different factors influence the way in which a consociation is going to work. This means that the central claim of consociationalism, same institutions, same results, is not true. Thank you very much.
Okay, ajde, ja sam pak oficijalno.
Okay, so you can put your, yeah, okay, officially. I will speak in Macedonian. Your paper is thorough, quite thorough, and what attracts my attention, and we can open a debate upon this, is that your comparative analysis is between the two agreements, the Ohrid and the Dayton Agreement. It's very thorough, very comprehensive, with identifying the shortcomings, the strengths and the weaknesses as well. And if I can speak about my own state and the Ohrid Agreement, I cannot say whether that is a good or whether it's a defeat or not to have signed that agreement. However, we had that fortunate of not having 200,000 or 100,000 victims or deceased. So we ended up with, or we concluded with a kind of a provisional constitutional compromise. I don't know, I'm not going to talk about whether that was a defeat or not. What attracts my attention is just going to talk about this basic difference that you talk about, interesting thesis in the political structuring and the formalization. We carried out certain amendments in the constitution and certain territorial division that we even today implement, and finally we are in the last stage of devolving of functions, decentralization. I'm just going to be brief, so that's about it. So your comparative analysis in terms of the political formalization was exceptional, so it was a very good impression. So we hope that we wouldn't live up to that destiny of having two nations living into one state and fighting over it. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question from Dr. Chepreganov. A very interesting paper that provided a comparative analysis between Bosnia and Macedonia. Now I'm going to ask, can we carry out a comparative analysis, whether that is feasible actually, whether we can compare them, because now we are a kind of a laboratory for examination which is called consociational democracy. The first question is whether this theory yields result before it's being applied. What will happen when this theory will be proclaimed as unsuccessful? Whether these two states will be a sort of guinea pigs or experiments to another one. Bosnian is at the verge of something else. Her agreement was unsuccessful. Fortunately, Macedonia is not there, but mostly due to the fact that in Bosnia we have the international factor, and the Macedonians managed to keep the internationals a bit far from the decision making. Then you had the ethno-national conflict slide here, whether in Macedonia and in Bosnia we have ethno-national conflict, since according to myself that is war. I agree that it's a phony war, which is not maybe the two wars between Germany and the Great Britain. We here had a civic ethno-national war. And you have a term when you use constitutional nationalism. Can you clarify or elaborate on this? And another thing, in Macedonia, the Albanian community is not banned the use of flags or other symbols. Albanians use much more symbols. We have had even certain disagreements at the start, but today you can convince yourself if you just go around and see to what extent the symbols have been used and make a comparison of to what extent the Macedonians, ethnic Macedonians, and the Albanians use their symbols.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. First, let me elaborate on the usefulness of consociationalism as a general theory and whether it was a success or not. I agree completely with you that in Bosnia it has failed. However, it is today the most, one author calls it the dominant theory in dealing with ethno-nationalist or plural conflicts. Now, of course, this does not mean that it is a good one, but it just means that it is a popular one. And why is it a popular one? Because you can get everybody to agree on it. Everybody is protected, everybody is included. And this is a strong incentive in order to choose this kind of approach. And I think that this is of course an ongoing debate whether consociationist structure is better than any other structure that one might think of, but I think that consociationalism is being badly treated through the examples of Bosnia in particular. We need to look at Northern Ireland, we need to look at Lebanon, where it worked in some cases and it failed in some cases, in both of those things. So the results are not that negative. However, they are also not that positive. So this means that the theory will stay, the theory will be applied, and it has been applied for 150 years, even before Arndt Leibhardt came up with the term consociational democracy. So this is the reason why we should study it, but our task as researchers should be to make it better, to propose certain new ways of thinking, of conceptualizing, for example, veto powers or something like that. So this would be to that. Then the term constitutional nationalism, it is not from me, I quote somebody whose name I forgot, but it refers simply to the fact that Macedonia was, per its constitution, a state of the Macedonian people, and the Macedonian the Orthodox Church was mentioned solely, according to what I've read, but perhaps this is not. So this is what this term refers to. So the state itself was a state for the Macedonians, and the Albanians felt left out. And this is what, it is understandable knowing your history and so on, that this is the outcome of 91, but this is what this term refers to. Then the symbols, I was not talking about about Albanian symbols, but simply that there were restrictions on what the symbols should be and so on, which one should be used. So, but I agree with you on that of course they are not banned. And just let me say one thing. You said whether the two states are guinea pigs for some other or the playing fields essentially of greater powers and greater interests and greater theories, and this is the case. I mean, we cannot deny that. However, we should make the best out of it.
Another question. Please be as brief as possible. I'm very glad that you've selected the topic. I have a very short question that refers to the concept of the social democracy. Why did you select this concept in addition to the fact that we have a unitary character of the state? Why didn't you choose the liberal theory or concept where the state should and must take care of each and every individual in the society? And constitutional nationalism is a term that lately was invented by Vilko Mlička. And the question is why you didn't select Lord Dworkin and why you selected Liebhardt?
I will have to be sure as we can discuss it bilaterally, but just saying my PhD thesis is about consociationalism in Bosnia, and Macedonia is referred to as a success story within the consociational literature. Now, we can analyze Macedonia from a liberal point of view, it's just not the thing that I do. I mean, this is just the fact that my research is about consociationalism. I'm a consociational scholar, and that's why I chose this particular thing. And why not liberals? And indeed, I would wish that there were more analysis of Bosnia and Macedonia within the liberal theory approach in mind.